Hi, I'm Ed Wilkinson, and welcome to On the Block. Today we're going to be talking with Father Steve Saffron, who is the pastor at St. Josaphat's parish over in Bayside. Father Steve, welcome.
Thank you much.
Good to see you.
Good to be with you.
Now, I remember back in your days in Bay Ridge at St. Anselm's, you were pretty well known for hanging out at the Harbor Fitness Club there, working out, trying to stay in shape. How did you get into that?
My home away from home.
Yeah.
It all started, I guess, 2 years ago. I stepped on the scale and I didn't like the number that I saw. And I was only off by 2 numbers, but it was enough to get me to start thinking about a healthier lifestyle. And I had belonged to another club, which I wasn't too happy with, so I decided to go check out Harbor Fitness. And I met a trainer who just introduced me to weightlifting, and then he moved on to something else, and I started working out with another trainer, which was all core stability kind of stuff and endurance training. And then I switched over to boxing. They hired a new woman to come in, and she's a boxing professional, and they said, "Oh, you might like this." So I go down 2-3 days a week just to do boxing, and then another couple days a week to do the weightlifting.
Now, do you work on the big bag or the little bag? Or?
Not so good with the little speed bag yet, but the big bag I do the body bag, all kind of workouts with it. Mm-hmm. I'm not sparring with anybody.
Right.
I've tried that, but
right.
It's just a workout of the exercise involved with boxing training.
How about the weightlifting? I mean, I've seen you throwing some big bundles of things around there that,
One of my favorite pictures is of myself flipping the 250-pound tire in the backyard that they have at Harbor Fitness. And it's just a great shot. I have a bandana on my head and sunglasses, and I'm flipping this tire. Yeah. And that's all part of that core, they call it CrossFit training. So I do a little bit of that outside there as well.
Now, do you feel better since
absolutely.
You've been doing that?
I dropped down a couple sizes in pants, and the weight, and I still have to watch the diet and all that, but it gives you a new focus, and it's a good stress relief. Being a priest in the parish, you always have to watch your P's and Q's and be nice to people, so it's nice to get out and be able to punch a bag and lift some weights, and it kind of takes the stress away, and you hang out with, there's a lot of good people there too, in the Bay Ridge community at Harbor. So
do they recognize you as a priest? They know who you are?
Some, not all.
Not all, okay.
And those that know I'm a priest, I tell them I'm just Steven here, because I don't need a line of confessions at the squatting rack.
Now, you're a relatively young guy. Most of the priests in the diocese are older than you. And we have this annual wellness day for priests to try to get it into their heads that they have to check with doctors and they have to stay fit. Do you find that that's beneficial, that priests need to be told that they have to do this, take care of themselves?
I think it is, because rectory life is not what it used to be 30, 40 years ago, where you were having maybe a cook in the rectory. Some places still do. Yeah. And so the chance of a guy being able to just go out and get fast food all the time and then just sit back, that's, I think, an epidemic. It's becoming a problem. And so I think it's more important for the guys to learn how to cook a little bit for themselves, live a healthier lifestyle, get out to the gyms, exercise, whatever it is. I didn't like any of this stuff until I just realized I need to do it. I have a family history on both sides that's not so good, so I figured I have to do this. If I want to take care of my temple of the Holy Spirit, I have to get out there and exercise and do something.
Yeah. No, it's very important, because say the men would have their wives to take care of. They make sure they go to the doctors. Right. There's no one's going to tell you to go to the doctor. You've got to take care of yourself, right? Exactly. So that comes in handy. Where did the idea of priesthood first come for you?
There's snippets throughout my life when I think about it. The very first time would be when I was an altar boy, and this would be in St. Stephen's in Perth Amboy, New Jersey. I was kneeling at the altar, and the priest was walking down from the tabernacle, and somehow I just thought it was so cool, somehow the vestments and whatever else, and he was a nice guy, Father Richard Abramovich. He's passed away now for several years. That was maybe the first hint.
How old were you?
About 8 years old, 7 or 8. It was right after First Holy Communion. I think as a child, my grandparents, even my parents, I think everybody knew that I'd probably become a priest, but I don't think I knew it. And then in high school, I was starting to think about it a little bit more, but fighting it. Went up to college. I started off at a county college. I went to public high school as well, Perth Amboy High in New Jersey. And I dressed up as the Pope for Halloween one year, so I think that was a sign. But I fought it for whatever reason. I'm not really sure why when I look back, but I did. And then ultimately I said, no, I'm going to go with this. It was around a Jubilee year. And then I entered the seminary and went with it.
When you say it was a Polish parish that you grew up in, is that your Polish heritage? Is that something that was emphasized in your household growing up?
My background is mostly Polish with a little German Irish. That's why I go to the St. Patrick's Day parade in Bay Ridge, you know. So the home parish was a Polish ethnic parish, 2 Polish masses on Sunday, and we had all the devotions and other cultural events. And so, you know, some guys will say that their spirituality is Franciscan or Dominican or whatever. My spirituality is Polish. And I mean that in the greatest respect of it, because it's the Polish devotional life, the culture. John Paul II was the Holy Father when I was a boy, so he inspired me too, and it all kind of clicked together. Polish parish, Polish Pope, you know. My grandparents were immigrants from Europe as well, from Poland. So there was a strong connection to Poland, not so much with the language. My father didn't speak Polish, my mother did fluently, and then I picked it up a little bit over the years, but not enough to be a fluent speaker either.
Saint Faustina is a Polish saint, and more well known now than, say, years ago, but was that somebody that was known in your household? Did you have devotion to Saint Faustina and Divine Mercy, or is that just a lately
That would
devotion?
be more recent in my life. I remember a parishioner who bought an image of the Divine Mercy for the parish, and then the pastor started to introduce a devotion, and that might have been around the year, it might have been in the late 90s or so. But it wasn't something I grew up at home with.
And you went to a public school, you said public high school. Were you close to the church during that time? Was that something that was difficult to stay connected to the church?
No, it wasn't. I still stayed close to the parish. I went to Perth Amboy High, like I said, and in those days, a good number of the teachers were all products of Catholic education. And so their classrooms were just as strict as it was in the grade school growing up. And they taught like religious sisters in many ways.
But then you went on to a public high school too, college rather, community college, right?
I started off at Middlesex County College, Middlesex, New Jersey. And then from there, well, there was also a disruption in my studies because my mother took ill. So I had to take time off to take care of her. And then once she was stabilized and my education at Middlesex came to an end, and then I went off to Seton Hall University.
Okay, well that's a transition point, so let's take a quick break here, and then we'll come back with Father Steve Saffron. You're watching On the Block. I'm Ed Wilkinson. Stay where you are. Coming right back to you. Welcome back to On the Block. I'm Ed Wilkinson, chatting today with Father Steve Saffron. So Father Steve, we were talking about you had to take a little time off from college because your mother got ill, so you had to take care of her. Did you have to work then for a living, or were you mostly at home taking care of her? What were those years like for you?
Sure. They were interesting years because, just to back up even to childhood, my father was sickly when I was a young boy, had a heart attack and became disabled and stayed home. So really had a good childhood in the sense I had a great connection to both my mother and my father. And even one time my mother jokingly said, "Your father actually raised you," you know, which was, I never really thought of it that way, but I guess in many ways he did. And then he died when I was only 19, and then my mother took ill, and I took time off, and during those years of her illness, I was actually working as a church organist, playing the organ for Holy Family in Carteret, New Jersey, which is now a merged parish of Divine Mercy.
So you always stayed close to the church, even during
Always
these
stayed
interim
close.
periods. When did you finally make the decision that, hey, I think maybe I should pursue this thing with priesthood and enter a seminary curriculum?
Sure. I was playing my very first Mass at Holy Family, and as the priest was walking down the aisle and I'm playing the opening hymn, I said to myself, this is fun. I'm happy to be able to do this because the organ and music were always an interest of mine, but this is not going to give me the happiness that I'm looking for. And so then I decided there I had to change my direction with my studies and go look into the seminary.
And you went to the seminary over at Seton Hall, right? That's the other Immaculate Conception. You know? What was that like for you to go in there? You had basically went to public school for maybe 6 years before that, and you're going into a Catholic theology setting. Was that an easy transition for you, or did that come natural?
The transition into the setting was what I expected, and maybe even more so. philosophy was not a major love of mine. So the philosophy studies for 2 years were challenging. They were fun, but I had good support with the other guys in the house and with the priest and everything else. It all works out in the end. So I started off officially in what you would call St. Andrew's College Seminary, which is a building about 6 blocks away from the main campus of Seton Hall University. And that's where I studied for 2 years for the philosophy degree.
So that would be pre-theology then, right?
Pre-theology.
And then you get your college degree, and then you go into the seminary, right?
Into seminary.
So how did you like the seminary? Some guys like the seminary, some guys don't like the seminary.
I liked it. Good professors, the rhythm of life, the formation program. I think the formation program really was very good because they touched on everything. I mean, we had hospice ministry, we had food pantry, parish experiences at different levels, just for an afternoon. And later on in the system, you go after lunch and stay until the end of the pastor's last responsibility. So you got to know priests, you got to know social outreach, various forms of spirituality. Priests would also come in on Fridays for our formation program and tell us, there would be themes that they would discuss with us. And so I think the formation aspect was very rich, something that I enjoyed.
Was there one particular ministry that you kind of took a shining to more than the others?
You know, the one, I always was interested in liturgy and had a love of liturgy. And the music director at the seminary, his formation talks really opened my eyes up more so to liturgy and to music. So it was that blending of a passion of mine with the organ and music, and now really mixing it in deeper ways with the liturgy. And so probably that's my most favorite.
What did your friends think and other members of your family? What did they think when you told them you were going into the seminary?
Well, it's about time.
They could see it before you did?
They saw it before I did.
Did anybody invite you to become a priest? Like a lot of young people say today, well, nobody ever asked me if I wanted to be a priest. And they say that's just been something that holds people back, that they would never ask to be a priest.
I think my pastor growing up was very supportive of me in every way possible, but I don't think he wanted to push. But yet at the same time, I knew he was, especially if I was serving devotions with him or something, conversations before funeral masses. There was always a very silent and strong push and encouragement. And another priest friend of mine too, who was also involved in education, down in Mount St. Mary's in Emmitsburg, Maryland. And sometimes I would drive him down or pick him up during a semester break, and those would be very good conversations. And then the priest that I worked with as an organist, you know, those cups of coffee in between masses. Again, a silent push, a strong push, but never like, why don't you? You know, it wasn't expressed verbally necessarily, but in their compassion and love and concern.
Right. What you've been saying is that, you know, you wanted something more in life, you saw something. What was that in the priesthood that really attracted you? What was it that you wanted to do with your priesthood?
I think constantly in the back of my mind is the re-evangelization of the importance of Sunday Mass and Eucharist. We have a lot of starving people, and they're hungry, but they don't know what they should be eating. And what they need to be eating is Jesus and the Blessed Sacrament. And so every time I get ready for Mass and I approach the altar, I'm thinking there might be somebody here who's just walked off the street for the first time, maybe rediscovering their faith. So I take the liturgy very seriously, hoping that people will realize they need the bread of life, they need our Lord in the Eucharist, and then maybe even those who come regularly could maybe in a different way go back to their families and say something about the example of the way Mass was celebrated and offered.
Well, you take evangelization seriously. I know you put some work into your homilies and you prepare. And how important is that for people when they come on Sunday to hear a good message from the pulpit? I mean, for many of them, this is the only contact they're going to have with the church that week.
Most recently, since last Christmas, I guess it was, the theme for me has been a living relationship with Jesus, because I think a lot of people get this idea that God is just this being that floats around in the sky, and that's not really religion. That's not the Catholic faith. You know, we're incarnational. And so to develop and strengthen that living relationship, a real relationship where people have an intimate relationship and desire to pray and to live the Catholic faith, to worship and adore in our churches, that's become a thrust in my ministry.
Mm-hmm. How did you find Brooklyn? You told us all about Jersey and growing up in Jersey and going to the seminary in Jersey. How did you ever find the Brooklyn priesthood?
Perth Amboy is a miniature of Brooklyn. So Brooklyn is Perth Amboy on steroids. It really is, because the various neighborhoods, they're all reflected in Perth Amboy. So coming here, I just felt like I was just moving to a different part of town. Mm-hmm. I've always had a great love of the city from my childhood. I mentioned John Paul II before. Another hero of mine in those days was John Cardinal O'Connor. Mm-hmm. So coming into the city for different events that he was at was a passion of mine, an interest of mine. My mother brought me into the city many times to see shows or other things. And so the city has always been home. I've now come to realize that Brooklyn is not the city. The city is across the East River. But coming from New Jersey, it's all New York City. And it's become home in every way possible, you know. The subway system and everything.
Yeah. Do you ride the subways?
I do.
Yeah.
If I could walk or take the subway, I'd prefer to do that over driving.
Mm-hmm. Okay, we're going to take another quick break. We've been talking with Father Steve Saffron, and when we come back, we're going to talk to him about Ordination Day and his ministry as a priest. So stay where you are. Welcome back to On the Block. I'm Ed, this is Father Steve, and we've been chatting about growing up in Jersey and then coming over here to Brooklyn, and how much alike Brooklyn and Perth Amboy are. So let's talk a little bit about Ordination Day when you were ordained here. What do you remember most about your Ordination Day?
Probably one of the things that every priest will mention, and that's the moment when the nose hits the marble.
Why is that? I mean, just about everybody says that
Yes.
to me.
It's that whole gesture of that prostration right out on the floor. It's just, I surrender. And I've always had a great devotion to the saints, especially to my patrons. Stephen, Anthony, and Gregory was my confirmation name. So you almost look in anticipation to hearing their name. Mm-hmm. And as you hear the name of that saint being called out, you're like, please, help me. I can't do this alone.
Right, because you're lying prostrate there, and the whole community then is singing the Litany of the Saints,
Mm-hmm.
right? So that, and so many guys mentioned that as being inspiring to them, that they knew that after that they were going to be all right. Mm-hmm. Were you nervous the day of your ordination?
Not really. I mean, nervous in the sense of, you go through the rehearsal of how you're going to move and all that kind of stuff. You want to keep that in the back of your mind, but not nervous in a personal or a spiritual way at all. To me, it was like, thank God this day is finally here, mm-hmm. because it was a climb, between the family issues and the sicknesses and everything else, those delays, but it all worked out, and it was really a day of thanksgiving.
Yeah. Now, when you were in the seminary, you were a little older than some of the other guys, I guess, that were with you. Was that a help for you, that you came in with more experience, more life experience for you? Was it, were you able to relate with some of the younger guys? How did that work for you?
There were no issues at all.
It
all worked out.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And you've been at St. You were at St. Anselm's for 6 years. Mm-hmm. Tell us a little bit about that, because Bay Ridge is a nice place. St. Anselm's is a very nice parish, and what was it like for you?
Well, I had to give credit to the other places too. I actually started off first as a deacon in St. Matthias in Ridgewood.
Okay.
With Bishop Scharfenberger.
Mm-hmm.
He was the pastor at that time. And then from there I went to St. Mark's in Sheepshead Bay for 1 year as a priest. Mm-hmm. And then I came to St. Anselm's in Bay Ridge, which is now 5 years. Mm-hmm. Every place is very different. Yeah. Every place has its own struggles, its own issues, but it's the people. Mm-hmm. To be with the people is a blessing, and Bay Ridge has good people.
Yeah. What's your greatest satisfaction as a priest?
It depends on the day. It really does. I mean, I've had a lot of different experiences, and maybe some experiences that some other priests who are older than I haven't even had in their ministry. I've dealt with someone who committed suicide, helping that family out. Mm-hmm. The different death experiences, the hospital situations, perhaps maybe because of a lot of time that I've spent in the hospital with my own parents, maybe has given me a different understanding of how to approach that part of the ministry. But to see a smile, mm-hmm. to see a tear come out of somebody's eye. Mm-hmm. Just recently I had a young man come up to me and said, I want to just talk to you before he was becoming an adult, under the law of age, He's still a kid in my eyes in many ways. But I said, I just want to talk to you as I enter my adulthood. All of those moments are just very, very powerful, and it would not have been done without the collar, without the priesthood. And so it becomes, every day could be very moving. And you don't know which direction it's going to move you. And I've never had a day where I've gone to my room and said, oh my God, what am I doing here? And I've heard some priests say that, you just want to run out sometimes. I've never had that feeling.
Yeah. What about young people today? Because we seem to have lost a lot of young people. They're certainly not in church on Sundays, and a lot of them seeing ambivalent toward religion. Do you find yourself making a special appeal, a special outreach to young people? What can you say to them to try to get them to pay attention?
Going back to the gym experience, for example, once people start to know who I am, then I get the questions. And I've come to realize that it's very important for us to offer good, solid catechesis. Because even somebody who has gone to grade school, and I don't mean any disrespect to our Catholic school systems, but somehow they didn't get it in those days. I don't know why. And they're either misinformed, or they don't know enough about what the church teaches, or the understanding of the church's view on certain issues. And once you explain it to them, then they're like, wow, really? There's one person at the gym. We'll go out maybe once a month or so after punching the bag for during the class. Then we go out and we actually talk church, And she's a nice woman who's coming back to the practice of her faith, and so we beat the bag together, and then we do catechesis together. So it's a fun experience.
Sure. How about adults? You mentioned that maybe a lot of them didn't get the same kind of religious education that they would have got years ago. How can, besides the Sunday sermon or homily, what other catechesis can we offer to them that they find attractive, that our lives are all so busy, that they would take the time out to listen to?
I think first we have to start with prayer. In these days of being an administrator now, one of my focuses will be to make sure the church is open. I think one of the worst things is a locked church. Now I know you have to take all kind of precautions because of security and everything else,
right.
But somehow when somebody goes and pulls on those doors and they're locked, I think they turn away and they don't return.
Sure.
To have an open door, they can come in and in their own way, however that is, to experience the silence of the church and the presence of the Blessed Sacrament is the first key. Once they experience that, then I think they start looking for the priest.
Yeah.
And then that begins that new relationship.
You mentioned your love of liturgy, and I know that you put your time into liturgy. You want to be a good celebrant. But you have a special fondness also for the extraordinary form of the liturgy, Mass in Latin. What do you find attractive about that? Why do people come and seek out that form of the liturgy?
I think there's a great sense of mystery that comes with the extraordinary form. It's interesting too, I would have never expected to be celebrating the extraordinary form as much as I do. So that's a blessing from this diocese, really, that I've been involved with that, and Bishop Mass and the other priests that are involved in Bishop DiMarzio's support as well. So it's a sense of the reverence and the mystery, the Gregorian chant, all of this. It plays on the senses, I guess you could say, where people are really, I don't know if force is the right word, but they're really drawn into the prayer because of the liturgical tradition of the extraordinary form.
Final question that I always like to ask. If a young man comes to you and says, hey, Father, I'm thinking about becoming a priest, what would you say to them? What kind of advice would you give to them?
Whenever you need a cup of coffee, come talk to Father. And you just build that relationship and open up their eyes to the church, to the life of prayer, find out what interests them, but make sure that, physically, I guess the door always can't be open, but make sure the door is open. And like I said, you offer them that cup of coffee and you just listen, talk, pray with, and gently push forward.
We hear it said so much today that God is still calling people to the priesthood, but they're not responding as often. Do you see that? Do you feel that God is still calling people? And why don't people notice this? Why don't they realize it?
A lot of noise. A lot of noise. As much as we're all attached to our cell phones and our modern devices, and they're good, don't get me wrong, but we get stuck just here.
Yeah.
And when the Lord calls you, you have to be able to look above the little machine in front of you, and it's real, it's personal. It's not an emoji, it's not a text message, it's a heart speaking to a heart.
Good. Very interesting conversation, Father Steve. Thanks so much. And thank you for watching. You've been watching On the Block. I'm Ed Wilkinson, been talking with Father Steve Saffron. See you again next time.